Berlin, springtime 1944. Behind a heavy door in one of the capital's fortified buildings, a group of Wehrmacht intelligence analysts huddled around a sprawling wooden desk. Reconnaissance photographs lay scattered across its surface, tangled among decoded transmissions and typewritten situation reports from the front. The room reeked of tobacco. Tension hung in the air like static before a storm. This wasn't an ordinary strategic session. They weren't calculating Allied supply routes or estimating tank production. They weren't mapping divisions or predicting Eisenhower's next diplomatic maneuver. Every document, every intercept, every scrap of intelligence on that table pointed to a single individual. One name surfaced repeatedly, underlined in red ink, highlighted, marked urgent. George S. Patton. For the better part of a year, Germany's military intelligence apparatus had devoted more manpower, more analysis, and more sleepless nights to tracking this one American officer than to any other figure in the Allied command structure. Not Dwight Eisenhower, who orchestrated the entire coalition war effort. Not Bernard Montgomery, Britain's celebrated victor at El Alamein. It was Patton who dominated their attention. His location, his intentions, his next move. In German command posts stretching from the Atlantic Wall to occupied France, the mere suggestion that Patton had arrived in a sector triggered immediate alarm. Maps were pulled, reserves repositioned, plans revised. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the aging, aristocratic commander overseeing Hitler's western defences, followed updates about Patton with something approaching personal fixation. Any intelligence suggesting where the American general might appear next landed on Rundstedt's desk within hours, stamped priority. Rundstedt had faced many capable opponents. He respected several. Some he even admired. But Patton was different. Patton unsettled him. That unease had roots stretching back more than 2 years, to November 1942, when German forces first crossed paths with him on the battlefield. Operation Torch brought American troops into combat against the Axis, for the first time in a major ground campaign. The plan called for simultaneous landings across North Africa. Patton led the Western Task Force, roughly 35,000 men hitting the Moroccan coastline along the Atlantic. German and Italian military observers paid close attention. They were curious. How would these Americans, untested and inexperienced, perform under fire? Conventional wisdom suggested they'd advance slowly, carefully. American military doctrine emphasized methodical preparation, stockpile ammunition, establish overwhelming artillery superiority, then, and only then, move forward. That's not what happened. Casablanca fell within 72 hours. French forces surrendered. Patton's troops had swept across territory at a speed that German analysts initially dismissed as reporting errors. It didn't fit American behavioral patterns. It didn't match expectations. Field reports kept arriving. This American commander was pressing forward with an operational tempo that defied what Berlin thought they understood about US capabilities. Within weeks, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commanding Axis forces in the Mediterranean, ordered a comprehensive intelligence file compiled on Patton. Who was this officer? What was his combat record? How did he approach warfare? The answers made things worse, not better. The dossier painted an unsettling picture. Patton, it turned out, had dedicated much of his military career to an exhaustive study of warfare, specifically German warfare. He could read German military theory in the original language. He travelled extensively through France and Belgium, walking the battlefields where Kaiser Wilhelm's armies had nearly broken through in 1914, and again in 1918. He hadn't just studied maps. He'd walked the ground, measured distances with his own stride, traced old attack routes through actual terrain, examined how German commanders had concentrated force, achieved breakthrough, exploited momentum. He understood more than German tactics. He'd absorbed German operational thinking, the philosophy of Bewegungskrieg, speed, shock, mass at the decisive point. German officers reviewing this intelligence came to an uncomfortable realization. This American had spent decades learning to think like a Prussian general staff officer. Then came February 1943. Kasserine Pass in Tunisia became a bloodbath. German and Italian forces under Rommel smashed through green American formations with devastating efficiency. US soldiers broke and ran. Equipment was abandoned. Command structures collapsed. Roads clogged with panicked retreats. It was the most humiliating defeat American ground forces would suffer in the entire European theatre. From Berlin's perspective, this confirmed their assessment. Americans had factories and resources, yes, but they lacked fighting spirit. They were industrial, not martial. German intelligence waited to see how Washington would respond. Would they retreat into caution, rotate out a few scapegoats and continue grinding forward slowly? The answer arrived in early March when Patton assumed command of 2 Corps, the same formation that had shattered at Kasserine. Within a fortnight, everything changed. The same units that had fled in disorder were now advancing aggressively. Patton imposed iron discipline. Helmets worn at all times, uniforms pressed, equipment maintained to exacting standards. But the transformation went far deeper than spit and polish. He rebuilt their confidence through relentless drill, uncompromising standards, and a command presence that made men stand taller when he passed. German reconnaissance teams began reporting something alarming. American patrols were no longer hesitant. They pushed forward boldly, probed defences aggressively, refused to be intimidated. Rommel himself noted privately that the Americans had suddenly become far more formidable. The shift was too rapid to be explained by reinforcements or better equipment. Something fundamental had changed in their leadership. The Germans made note of who was now in charge. Summer 1943, the Allied invasion of Sicily. On paper, Montgomery's British 8th Army had the starring role, driving up Sicily's eastern coast toward Messina. Patton's 7th Army was assigned flank security, a supporting mission, secondary importance. Patton had other ideas. Once his forces hit the beaches, he drove them across Sicily's western and central regions at extraordinary velocity. Towns fell in rapid succession. His columns moved at speeds that shocked his own staff officers and left German defenders scrambling. 38 days after landing, having fought across roughly 200 miles of hostile mountainous terrain, he reached Messina first, beating Montgomery despite starting farther away and facing more difficult geography. German after-action analyses reflected grudging respect mixed with alarm. One officer noted that Patton fought more like a panzer commander than an American infantry general. He accepted risks that Allied doctrine typically prohibited. He struck before defenders could fully organize, driving into gaps the moment they appeared rather than waiting for ideal conditions. To German eyes, he behaved disturbingly like their own best commanders, only now wearing the wrong uniform. At the height of this success, Patton nearly ended his own career. In August 1943, visiting field hospitals in Sicily, he encountered soldiers evacuated for psychiatric trauma, what was then called battle fatigue. Combat stress wasn't well understood. Patton viewed these men through a harsh, outdated lens, cowards who'd abandoned their units. In 2 separate, now infamous incidents, he physically struck soldiers he believed were malingering. In one case, he drew his sidearm and threatened to execute a man on the spot. When Eisenhower learned of this, he erupted. The scandal leaked. American newspapers ran condemnations. Congressional representatives demanded Patton's recall. The general who'd just delivered critical victories in North Africa and Sicily now teetered on the edge of disgrace and dismissal. In Berlin, intelligence officers followed the scandal with fascination and hope. They'd already concluded Patton was the Allies' most dangerous field commander. If the Americans removed him over political controversy, it would be an unexpected gift. But Eisenhower made a calculated decision. He reprimanded Patton severely. He sidelined him publicly, but he didn't fire him. German analysts understood what that meant. The Americans valued Patton too highly to waste him, which meant he'd be held in reserve for something crucial. By early 1944, Patton was in England, but not commanding any obvious invasion force. German intelligence tracked his presence. They noted his public appearances, monitored radio traffic from his supposed headquarters. Yet when they examined Allied order of battle data for the anticipated invasion, his name wasn't attached to the formations slated for the initial assault. That made no sense. The Germans reasoned that the Allies wouldn't bench their most aggressive, proven commander during the war's most decisive operation. Therefore, he must be leading something larger, something they hadn't fully detected yet. They were half right. Patton was central to Allied planning, just not in the way they imagined. 1st US Army Group, Supposedly under his command and massing in southeastern England was a Phantom. Its tanks were inflatable rubber props. Its aircraft were painted canvas stretched over wooden frames. Entire base camps were theatrical sets. Radio traffic was scripted performance. It was an elaborate illusion designed to convince the Germans that the main invasion would strike at Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point across the English Channel, and it worked perfectly. The Germans, believing that wherever Patton positioned himself must indicate the primary attack, swallowed the deception completely. When Allied forces stormed ashore at Normandy on June 6, 1944, nearly 150 miles west of Calais, German commanders hesitated. Was this the real invasion, or a feint designed to lure them into committing their reserves prematurely? Rundstedt wanted to throw his panzer divisions at the Normandy beachhead immediately, to crush it before it could consolidate. But Hitler and his staff remained fixated on Calais, on Patton. They believed the decisive blow must still be coming where Patton supposedly waited. For 6 critical weeks, powerful German armoured formations sat idle near Pas-de-Calais, waiting to repel an attack that would never materialise. Those divisions, which might have thrown the Allies back into the sea during Normandy's vulnerable early days, remained chained to the phantom threat of Patton's non-existent army group. August 1st, 1944, Patton returned to active combat as commander of US Third Army. The Germans immediately understood their nightmare had materialised. Freed from his deception role, Patton transformed the Normandy campaign. In the first 2 weeks of August, his army covered more ground than some Allied formations had gained in 2 months of grinding hedgerow combat. Third Army exploded out of the Avranches breakout, swept into Brittany, seized critical ports, then wheeled east in a massive armoured manoeuvre across France. German units that had spent weeks carefully preparing defensive positions suddenly discovered American columns behind them, cutting roads, severing supply lines, overrunning headquarters and communication centres. Field commanders sent increasingly desperate reports to higher echelons. The Americans were everywhere. Their front lines seemed to evaporate and reappear miles away within hours. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, who'd replaced Rundstedt, stared at maps that no longer made operational sense. He'd mark the front line, then receive reports that Patton had already crossed it. Orders dispatched to German divisions arrived obsolete. By the time units reached their assigned positions, Third Army had already outflanked them. German staff officers began describing Patton's advance as a flood they couldn't channel or contain. By mid-August, Patton saw an opportunity to deliver a strategic killing blow. German forces retreating from Normandy were funneling through a narrowing corridor near Falaise. If Allied forces could seal that gap, they'd trap hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers along with their remaining armour and artillery. Patton drove Third Army north toward the pocket, while Canadian and Polish units closed from the opposite direction. As the noose tightened, the German retreat disintegrated into chaos. Soldiers jammed roads in desperate, disordered columns. Vehicles were abandoned when fuel ran out or when Allied aircraft struck. Command and control evaporated. The Falaise pocket became a killing ground. More than 50,000 German troops were captured. Thousands more died. Losses in tanks, guns, and transport vehicles were catastrophic. Officers who survived later compared it unfavourably to Stalingrad. At least at Stalingrad, they argued, there'd been time to dig in, to organise, to prepare. Against Patton, they felt hunted, driven like animals, overrun before they could catch their breath. After Germany's surrender, Allied interrogators questioned captured German generals extensively about the commanders they'd faced. Their responses revealed a clear hierarchy of respect and fear. Montgomery, they acknowledged, was competent and thorough, but predictable. He favoured meticulous preparation and overwhelming material superiority before attacking. Because his methods were systematic, they could usually anticipate his intentions. Bradley, they said, was solid but conservative. He rarely gambled and generally adhered to established doctrine, which made his decisions easier to forecast. But when the conversation turned to Patton, the tone shifted. German generals used words like unberechenbar, unpredictable, aggressive, dangerous. Rundstedt stated flatly that Patton was the Allied general they feared most. General Fritz Bayerlen, who commanded the elite Panzer Lehr division, remarked that Patton was the only Allied commander who genuinely possessed the instincts of a German panzer leader. He reminded them of Rommel, bold, opportunistic, constantly probing for weakness. Except now, Rommel's mirror image was driving American armour. Patton didn't fight according to the cautious, safety-first principles German officers associated with Western Allied forces. He advanced when doctrine suggested consolidation. He kept pushing when logisticians recommended pausing. He launched attacks that appeared premature on paper, but succeeded through sheer speed and surprise. German planners, accustomed to reading patterns in their opponent's behaviour, found him deeply unsettling because he consistently shattered those patterns. They could never quite predict where he'd strike next, only that when he did, he'd come fast and hit with overwhelming violence. December 1944, Germany's final desperate gamble in the West. Through the snow-choked forests of the Ardennes, Hitler launched a massive surprise offensive designed to split the Allied armies and capture the vital Belgian port of Antwerp. The attack ripped through thinly defended American positions, sending units reeling backward in confusion. The 101st Airborne Division found itself encircled at Bastogne. Cut off, outnumbered, and under relentless pressure, Eisenhower convened an emergency conference at Verdun, asking his field commanders how quickly they could organise a counter-offensive to relieve Bastogne and blunt the German advance. Most offered timelines measured in weeks, rotating large formations in winter, rearranging supply chains, disengaging from current operations and pivoting to a new axis. It all required careful staging and time. Patton offered something different. He said he could attack in 48 hours with 3 divisions. The other generals stared at him, incredulous. It sounded like showboating, an impossible promise. You couldn't rotate an entire army 90 degrees and hurl it into battle in 2 days. Not in winter, not logistically possible. But Patton held a card no one else had. He'd seen this coming. His intelligence chief, Colonel Oskar Koch, had warned him weeks earlier that German divisions were disappearing from the line, massing somewhere out of sight. While other headquarters dismissed the possibility of a major German offensive, convinced the enemy was too exhausted and depleted, Patton had listened. Quietly, without fanfare, he'd ordered contingency plans drafted for exactly this scenario. So when the Ardennes erupted and the German attack rolled forward, Patton didn't start from zero. He made one phone call. Orders that had been prepared and refined in advance suddenly activated. Third Army began pivoting north almost immediately. More than 250,000 men and tens of thousands of vehicles started moving across icy, narrow roads. Traffic control became critical. Supply lines had to be reversed, command posts reoriented, but the mechanism had been prepared. When he threw the switch, it worked. German planners, confident they had at least a week before any major Allied counterattack could form, were stunned when Patton's forces smashed into their southern flank within days. The march to Bastogne through brutal winter conditions, the armoured thrust that broke through to the besieged 101st on December 26th, and the sustained pressure Third Army applied to the southern shoulder of the Bulge, all combined to strangle Germany's last offensive hope in the west. After the war, when German generals were asked what went wrong during the Battle of the Bulge, many gave variations of the same answer. They hadn't expected Patton to react so quickly. They'd calculated time in weeks. He'd responded in days. Once again, they'd underestimated his speed. Once again, they paid for it. So why, ultimately, did German generals fear George S. Patton more than any other Allied commander? The answer lay in an uncomfortable mirror they saw every time they studied his campaigns. He understood their doctrine. German military philosophy emphasized Bewegungskrieg, mobile warfare built on speed, concentration of force, shock, and relentless exploitation of any breach in enemy defences. The blitzkrieg that had shattered Poland, crushed France, and driven deep into the Soviet Union was founded on these principles. German officers had internalized them through years of training and combat. Then they encountered an enemy commander who operated from the same intellectual framework. Patton had spent decades absorbing German theories of warfare, reading their manuals, analysing their campaigns, tracing their manoeuvres, and converting their concepts into his own practice. When he led an army, he used their own tools against them. He drove faster than they anticipated, attacked before they were ready, refused to give them time to reform coherent defensive lines. He fought the kind of fluid, mobile war they prided themselves on, and did it backed by American industrial power. There was another factor that deepened their fear. With most Allied commanders, German analysts could construct behavioural models. They could predict, this man won't attack without overwhelming artillery support, or that one will pause to consolidate before pushing forward, or he won't risk exposed flanks. Patton broke those models. He attacked when calculations suggested he should pause. He drove forward when logistics appeared to demand a halt. He seemed willing to accept overextension if it meant seizing initiative, and more often than not, those gambles succeeded. The Germans never knew exactly what he would do. They only knew he'd rarely choose the safe, predictable option. That uncertainty unnerved them. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, who'd commanded German forces on D-Day and faced some of the war's finest generals, summarised his assessment of Patton after the war in blunt, simple terms. Patton, he said, was the supreme master of mobile warfare among the Allies, a brilliant practitioner of offensive operations, and the Allied general the Germans feared above all others. From the wind-swept North African desert to Sicily's rocky highlands, from Normandy's tangled hedgerows to the frozen Ardennes forests, George S. Patton earned that fear. Battle by battle, advance by advance, he forced Germany's most experienced commanders to experience what they'd once inflicted on others, the disorienting shock of facing an opponent who thought like they did, only faster, more relentless, and backed by inexhaustible industrial strength. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favour. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people who care about the heroes who got forgotten. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing these stories from archives and obscurity every single week. You're not just a viewer, you're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching.